Okay, fine. So let's start our series of group lessons. Well, I'm FIDE Master Viktor Neustroev. In this series of group lessons, we may have some new students who didn't enroll in previous courses, neither for the one that was devoted to attack and defend, nor the previous one, which was quite long. This exact course will be devoted to the endgame. So we are going to talk about the technique. Well, it consists of 12 lessons, and today maybe you'll find that today's topic is quite hard, but I'm going to talk about essential principles. If you don't know what to do in the endgame, at least this knowledge will provide you with some guidance. Okay, again, we are waiting for more people to join. And in a few minutes, we will start with the analysis of the concrete positions. So today, what we are going to talk about? What are these three principles? We are going to talk about king activity, so the centralization of the king, rook and king placement, how these pieces should be located, and the most important one is recognizing weaknesses and weak pawn that you can attack and critical squares that you can occupy. I prepared the kind of a presentation of what we are going to talk today. Here it is. Okay, so this is what we are going to talk about. How to activate your king, when, how to set your king and rook, how they should coordinate among each other, and how to recognize critical squares and pawns that you should attack. Because in the end game, we usually don't, we're not trying to deliver checkmate, we're not attacking the king. This can be done only occasionally in case if, for example, we think that the enemy king is still compromised and we can like take advantage of it, or if we see that there is not much we can do, there are no weaknesses, but definitely the enemy king is weak, we can look for some mating traps. But what you should understand about the end games that you may set mating threads, you may set some traps to checkmate the king, you may use these like attacking features. However, you should understand that your goal is not to deliver a checkmate. Your goal is to win the game, and usually you win the game if you promote your pawn. In order to promote a pawn, you should create a passed pawn. In order to create a passed pawn, you should capture the enemy pawns that stop you from doing it. And sometimes you cannot even promote, but your passed pawn plays a very significant role. It may distract the enemy piece, either the rook or the king, and let you do something else. For example, let you enter the enemy camp on the other side of the board and then create a pass pawn there, and because of that win. So we are almost not doing any attack in the end game. We are trying to play positionally, look for weaknesses, attack them, capture enemy weaknesses, occupy crucial squares, and promote our passed pawns. Occasionally there can be some mating ideas, but this is not our goal. So don't try to deliver checkmate. Okay, fine. So just one more thing. So more people joined. Let me explain how this course is structured. 12 lessons. Well, the first will be a general class about endgame principles. However, then we will study each type of endgame, so pawn endgames, rook endgames, minor piece endgames, queen endgames even. in more details, and you learn what you typically should do in this or that type of an end game. And there will also will be complex in games where at least one of the players has a rook and something else, a rook and a minor piece and the pawns, like that. Why we usually analyze in games with rooks? Well, the rooks enter the end game. The rooks enter the game last, and that's why they are likely to stay almost until the end of the game. So that's why, like, maybe 60% of all end games consist of rooks. Okay, so what else? I'm going to illustrate some key ideas. For example, today I'm going to talk about principles. Then your task will be to do the homework. So for today, I prepared 3 games and 3 positions for you to study, to practice as a homework. And it's not much, but you should understand what you are doing. And that will be the best way. Well, how do you do this homework? You look at the position, you do the task, you suggest the plan, then you try to calculate what happens if you initiate this plan. And after that, you check answers and look for how your move, how your plan corresponds with the moves played in the original game. You can either read it from a PDF that I'm going to send together with the recording, or you can enter the study on Lichess. I'm providing you with the links. Everyone may join. And I mean, everyone who is enrolled into this course may join and make the moves to make sure that his plan was correct. Even if not, if there are some deviations, so if you think that this or that worked or not, you can check it with the engine, but this is what I don't recommend. Well, this is a course for chess players with online rating, like with chess.com rating from 1200 to 18. If you are about like that, it's great. Well, if not, it's still okay. It's still okay. You can work on this course and then decide if it's too complicated or too simple. I don't think it's too complicated, actually. At the same time, I don't think it's too simple, and even 2,000 players will find some insights here. Does it make sense to learn some basic endgame checkmates? Well, it's not the most crucial thing. What you should learn is that you should activate your pieces. So knowing patterns, no, it's not necessary in my opinion. Well, at least when I was studying endgames, I didn't know any mating patterns and was able to create mating combinations myself on fly during the game. It wasn't a big issue. What you should be good at is probably calculation, but in the end game, it's easier to calculate. You're unlikely to miss anything because fewer pieces are only left on the board. Anyway, let's start. Fine. The first position is devoted to the king centralization. The material is equal. White has some space, right? But is it a winning position or not? And if white has chances to play for a win, then how exactly should they play for a win? So I'm looking for your suggestions, guys. Hello everyone, this is FIDE Master Viktor Neustroev and okay, so Rook D1. Rook D1 is a nice suggestion. So can you please specify why exactly you would like to play this move? So bring the rook to the open file. Bring the king to the action and push f5 and e6 to create a passed pawn. So put the rook on the open file is a good idea. Yeah, so Brian also suggests to control the open file. Then wants to even invade the 7th rank if it's possible. Good point. And Brian wants to double. Okay, yes, but how to create a passed pawn? So here, material is equal, you can create a passed pawn, but before doing this, you should occupy an open file. So doing rook d1, rook d3 works perfectly well because this is how you don't allow your opponent to enter your camp through the d file, and then the king's activation. The king should go somewhere to e4 and support this pawn. And it seems that it's almost impossible to win if black makes no mistake. And you should understand that, yes, if it's approximately equal in game and your opponent plays really well, you may not win. But if you know how to play in games, you are likely to outplay your opponent because everyone makes mistake. Even a grandmaster makes mistakes. So if you understand what you are doing, you are likely to win even if this endgame is approximately equal. So rook d1 was played. The idea is to occupy the open file. So Soviet masters once, often said in Soviet Union or in Russia after that, in maybe 1990, well, when I was learning chess, well, I've listened to what Soviet coaches told me, and not only me, but to other students too. So if you don't know what to do, put the rook to the open file. It may become helpful later in the game. So rook d1. And black should fight for this file what they didn't do in the game. So of course they should play rook f d8 or rook a d8. And if so, fight for the file with rook d3. Yes, it leads to a rook trade. The position becomes more simple, and because of that, black is closer to a draw, but having the file is crucial. Now, black may lose if they don't play a proper move. What do you think? Which move they should play? Okay, good point from Brian that most of the time when the game passes to the end game, chess players don't have much time. They usually spend a lot during the middle game stage, and that's why there is a chance of making a mistake. So it's always good if you understand what you are doing in the end game. So the rook wants to go to the 7th rank, and here some of you already make mistakes. You suggest playing king f8, after which the rook invades your camp and the king's position becomes passive even if you play that move. Well, for example, this you can already play e6, and if you play e6, they take, you can capture there, threatening to take h7, threatening to win a rook, so it will be a winning position. You have to play f6 instead. That's right, you have to make this pawn isolated. So they can play e6, and not king f8, not rook a8, but f5. Otherwise, white plays f5, and the pawn becomes a protected pass pawn. So f5, rook goes to d7, and rook e8. Rook a7, rook a6. Yeah, the king is still cut off, but it's possible for black to hold this position. The white king also cannot move because the e file is under the black's control. These pawns are not weak, just pushing one pawn protects the other one. It can be already protected by the rook, or maybe this pawn goes. And, well, just activating the king, moving it to f6, allows black to hold the position. So this is how black could draw the game. Well, can you take? I don't think so. Then the king goes to f7. No, they take, then the king goes to f7. But anyway, you should fight and you should play rook d7, occupying the 7th rank, but at the same time, you shouldn't make this pawn a weakness. Okay, the game here continued with this move, rook f e8. Well, why that? I actually don't know. Maybe they wanted king f8 and rook e7. Rook d3, doubling, king f8, and what now? So here we can play rook d7, for example, or move the king. Don't you want to play rook to d7 instead? Okay, so both moves are good. Yes, rook d7. Well, actually, no, not rook d7. If you play rook d7, they can react with rook e7 just. And what then? If you take, the enemy king is centralized while yours is not. If you deliver a check, who cares? They can take once and then play rook e8. And if you do so, they play rook e7. Even if you do so, they play rook e6. So that's why there is no practical point of playing this move. Because after king e8, you have to take a decision whether you retreat back or you trade. So that's why right now rook d7 is too premature. Instead, let's better activate the king. The king goes to f2. They play c5. Now their pawns are protected. That was actually a good move. Later you'll see why. Why does rook d6 fail? Rook d6 doesn't fail, but rook d6, rook e6. The c6 pawn will be protected. Ah, you mean, okay. So, well, okay. So this king f8, this rook d6 in this position, because now rook e6 may lead to a pawn blunder. Yeah, because I thought that you are talking about this position. Now, this is where black is fine. But if you are talking about rook d6 right away, I think they can just play c5. This is enough. So rook d6 and... okay, let's go back to previous variation of d7. This, rook goes, no, check, 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 this, and they are threatening to take. Because the pawn will be too far from the king and it's an easy target for the black king. But with two rooks, having the rook on d6 was okay. So c5, king e8, then rook e6, for example. Then maybe f6 even. Okay, fine. Later in the game, rook d6 was played. They can never take, but what your rook is doing on d6? Now rook d7 still failed because of the same reason. And, well, you can do this. They can invade your camp, rook d7. And now, well, I think it does make sense for you to enter the center. This is actually a fine position because, again, if this move you have a 6, after they take rook g7, so they don't want to lose material. That's why probably they have to play something like that, or maybe king f8. Well, king f8 means rook h7, and you are pawn up already and still threatening to win a rook. So maybe this move, and in this position, king e3, and this pawn dies. This take, centralize the king and create a passed pawn on that flank, distract the king, capture this and move to the queen side, and you're winning. So c5, king goes to f3. This move is possible too. This is where they played rook e6. Maybe they didn't want rook d6 to happen. Let's say if rook d6 in this position, similar to what Brian suggested, what may happen? What if they take? Which piece should we take? With a rook or with a pawn? So pawn takes, for example, then this pawn can be attacked. I don't know how exactly is it's better to play here in this position, but white king, well, white king is fast enough, but you should predict the next move of your opponent, and it can be this move, after which the king doesn't go there, and d7 is a mistake in such a case, because they win a pawn. You just don't have enough time to defend it. So you should be accurate with this pawn. Yes, it is a passed pawn, but let's say they play king e8. So king e4, king d7. And you cannot progress, but they can do this. And maybe you even lose the pawn then. That's why after king e8, you have to play this, check, and they just go back. And then bring the rook. You have to go there, and then they bring the king again. Something like that. So it's too early to play rook d6. Rook d7 was played. So the rook went there. No, rook e6 was not a super good move. What do you think white wants to play on the next move? Who can suggest? I also would like to share a few short videos that I recorded devoted to the endgame. So this is the first one, and the second. So these are my recent videos. They are short, published on my YouTube channel. Okay, how should we play? Rook b7 to get this rook. Well, f6 was played in the game. We're going to talk about this move, but let's talk about rook b7 with the idea of rook d7. So, well, let's say which move they can play. King e8, for example, rook there. Now rook e7, and you have to trade it, and then you cannot invade the enemy camp. So if black plays king e8, you cannot play that. What you have to do in this position is bringing your king. So rook e7, for example, trade and play f5. Well, this is not 100% winning position, but you can play something like that and try to invade the enemy camp and, well, trade the rooks at a certain moment of the game, maybe chase the king away with f6, and try to attack his weaknesses either with the king by invading b7 or with your rook in case if, let's say, there is a pawn on h7 isolated and you play something like that. This didn't happen in the game. f6 was played, but before playing a6, let's talk about rook e6. Well, why this natural move is a mistake? So rook d7, then they played f6, and now white managed to exploit this setup. Well, looks a bit complicated, but let me explain. Before I explain, let's take a look at c4 move. c4, what does this move do for the position? This move actually could allow black to play for a draw. How exactly? Well, if this move just rook a c8 and they have a counterplay, they can activate their pieces. Activity of rooks is also a very important basic principle of the endgames. So please don't forget about it. I do not mention it because I think it's too obvious. However, many people forget that activity is sometimes better than material. Let me illustrate it. For example, rook d7, rook e7, rook d8, rook e8, they take there and invade our camp. Looks like white is winning. Their king is close, they can attack this pawn. No, black can draw the game due to the activity of their pieces. How? Well, they can try rook c8, rook a7, c3. It's impossible to stop this pawn, so white should take it, otherwise c2, c1, and so on. This, king goes to the center, logical, check, king goes there, and it's too far from the pawns. If the king retreats, there will be another check, and another check if needed. So, attacking the pawns. How to play? The h2 will be lost. Maybe instead it's possible to try to play for a checkmate. But this check, there was a mating threat, but after rook e2 the king goes to a different position, there is no checkmate, and it's possible to take on g2. Once the king comes closer, this pawn can be protected, and if white decides to capture it with a rook, maybe like that, they definitely lose the one on a2, and then it's 2 versus 2 on one side, and it's definitely a draw. Or instead of playing rook c8, they could even sacrifice a pawn with c3 move. B takes, rook c8 now. How to play? Well, rook a7, rook c3, and it's the same situation. But if rook goes to d3, then it still can be a draw even without a pawn. Why? Because of the activity of these pieces. So the rook goes there, a2 is a weakness, the king goes to e6 and is able to cover the squares that the enemy rook may invade. So black missed this idea of doing c4, played rook e6, and after that the game is lost. But it doesn't look like a losing position. So how white should play in order to win? So this move, king e4, works. In the game it was f6. f6 allows us to play for a win in case if we play what? King e4. King e4 is suggested by Dan. Let's take a look at this move. Brian suggests rook 1 d6. Erosh also suggested rook 1 to d6. Ah, no. Okay, sorry. Okay. So let's talk about this move. Then f takes e5, f takes e5. Rook goes to e8, e8. Then defense. And what can you say about the position? Is white winning? Well, black is attacking, but this is hanging. White is a... No, white is not a pawn up, but if white takes on a7, he is. It's actually drawish. But it's only drawish if black uses his activity principle. No, well, it's black to move first. Rook h6, attacking there. And this is drawish. For example, rook a7. In this position, let's first include a check or not. What do you think? Now let's take on h2 first. And if this move is played, then just rook g2 and the g7 pawn is protected. Well, yeah, so this counter attack allows black to draw the game. Maybe h3 to save it, but in case of h3, there will be a check, after which the king has to go back, because if he goes there, we can do another check and then take on e5 if the king goes further from the pawn. And we can also try even g6, because if he goes there, it's this. This, then, for example, this move. attacking both pawns and trying to check from behind. Should be fine for black. So rook 1 to d6 should be played, and this time this move has some tactical solution behind it. How to play? In the game they took. But what if they play rook e7? There is no better move, because, well, something like that loses. How exactly does it lose? Well, it takes f6 just. Pawn takes, rook takes, rook takes, rook takes h7. And it's extra pawn and the pass pawn. And a7 is also a weakness. That's why they have to take on d6. If they play this move, it's simply capture. Rook captures rook. Because if pawn captures pawn, it's rook takes f6 with a check. And white wins the pawn. If this move, it's this. And now, again, the h7 is lost. Then the king has to go to g8 and so on. It's a losing position. So rook takes d6. Now, another question for you. Which piece to capture with? Your rook or your pawn? Okay, so Ali suggests to capture with a pawn, and it's absolutely right. Okay, Brian wants to take with a rook. So the idea of capturing with a pawn is to keep the rook on the 7th rank, which means that the enemy king's actions are limited. How they can play? If they play rook e8, they do not invade our camp. We cover most of the ranks. They can go to the first rank, but they are likely to lose 2 pawns, at least. So when king e8, it's rook g7, exactly. And white has an easy plan. The king goes to c6, and then the pawn is promoted. So that's why it's better to take with a pawn. If you take with a rook, then I think they can just continue with king e7 in this position. So you cannot take, your rook is hanging. You can move your king further, but why is it winning? For example, he goes that way, take, let's say this, just rook c8, for example. How to win? There is no even possibility to invade. You can try this move, but what then? I just play this. And then I have a counter attack. Okay, so taking with the pawn doesn't allow the enemy rook to get activated, as well as white can keep the rook on the 7th rank and cut the king off. So rook e8, rook e7. What if he doesn't play this move? What if he doesn't sacrifice this pawn on a7 voluntarily? For example, what can he play? Let's say king g8. What would you do in such a case? Can't you play rook c7, d7, and rook c8, or something like that? Rook e7, rook e7, king f8, then what? Oh, then you can bring the king, for example. Or rook e7, they can play rook d8. And then if you play d7, then they play king f8. Okay, so rook c7 is better than rook e7, but I still don't like it. For example, this. Now rook c8 is a threat, but king goes to f7. Rook a7, king goes there, and the d7 pawn is lost. But maybe you have a chance to capture the one on b6. However, there is no guarantee that this is a winning position, because this rook now becomes active. And even without a pawn, black can play for a draw. That's why the best way is just simply to activate the king. King f4, king d5, and then the king helps the pawn to get promoted. Okay, so rook e8 was played. They decided to sacrifice the pawn. Rook goes to d8 because what else? If not, then this is the next move, and then the b6 pawn lost. So rook d8. Rook d8 forces us to play this move. King goes to e7. So the last line of defense. What should we play in this position? And let's decide whether black threatens to take on d7 or not. What do you think? So should we capture the b6 pawn so we can play this move? They take, we take there, for example. This is one feature. We can bring the king and let them take, but then we have to trade, I think. Is that pawn in game winning or not? Okay, Brian suggests to play king f4, and after rook captures pawn, king captures, well, rooks are traded, the king goes to d5, right? Well, then suggests to play rook b7 and win a pawn on b6 and hope on the passed pawn, which is the a pawn. Well, possible, but it's not winning. The d rook is active enough. You still can play it for a win, and maybe you will win, but it's not totally winning. So if your opponents play properly, you are likely to draw the game. But everyone makes mistakes, especially club players and especially in the end game, because people usually don't study end games. So king f4, but when you play king f4, you take all responsibility of rook d7. Rook d7, so rook takes, king d5. How do I identify this endgame as completely winning for white? What can you say? Because of which factors this is a winning endgame? Well, opposition, yes, but we still have tons of pawn moves. The king is more centralized. Yes, the White King is better centralized, but I also should say that here, instead of the King's centralization, well, there are three factors that guarantees a win in this position. First, with King d5, White has more space. And having more space usually offers more reserved tempi to chase the king away, to chase the enemy king away from opposition and invade his camp. Yeah, the king is closer to the action. The king is already into the enemy territory, and that's why it's more. The king is like closer to the enemy pawns that he can capture, so he is closer to invade the enemy camp. Well, what can potentially happen? Let's say g5, take g4, h6. There is a position. We play h3, or maybe we play a4. Like that. So, and if they move it further, then we just come and take it. So here even the position doesn't matter. In case of d7, then we do b5, we use our reserve tempi and invade the enemy camp. So king c7, king e6. Here I would even suggest you to capture the b pawn, which you definitely can do. So this, and then you take it, and then you can go to the other side and capture these two. So the pawn on d7 is poisoned, and due to the king's position, due to the king ability to go to d5 and offer more space for white in the pawn endgame. King d6, because of that, a4. Why a4? So this is also an important move because it fixes a pawn structure. And later, for example, if this king is there, there is a possibility of doing a5, undermining and capture this pawn. King goes to c6. How to play now? What do you think? Okay, so king f5 or g4 are ideas that Brian suggested. King f5 suggested by Ali. So the idea of king f5 is to play king e6. So we can talk about g4 later, but at the moment, I don't fully understand the purpose of g4. It seems to me that g4 is in order to play g5 and distract this pawn and to move the king to e5. If so, then yes, I think it's a possible idea. But after you play g5, they take, you take, they can play king d6 and stop your king coming to e5. So that's why probably you should start with king f5 move first. What happens if the king goes to d6? So they cannot play g6 and chase us away because f6 is vulnerable. But they are going to continue with king e7 and then g6. Then g6 with a pawn, chasing our king away. What do you think about that? Rook b7 looks good, but no, well, this is what Brian suggested. I don't declare it. So rook b6 with the idea of capturing, but rook b6, king c6, and it's a repetition. So king goes to d6. How should we continue if we want to win? Ideally, we should invade the enemy camp and move our king to e6. a5. And if b takes a5, rook a6, but king d7. There is one more thing that you should remember when you play such positions. We are going to talk about it later at this class, but later at the final stage of our class. What I want you to remember is that why do people don't want to double pawns? Why they are taking care about the pawn structure in the middle game, for example? The answer is because it matters in the end game. So a pawn structure matters in the end game. In middle game sometimes too, but in end game it matters a lot. So that's why you can make some defect in the enemy position. And on the king side, for example, you can play you can play h4. Okay, let's talk about the idea that Ali suggested. So this check, and if king takes, there is a check with this. Okay. So looks like you are right. I shouldn't capture because then I lose there. Well, I'm not sure if it's so bad, but let me play king d5. What's your plan then? Because if you take, this time I take with a rook. And how else you protect this pawn? You can go there only, but then I can bring the king back and at least repeat the position. So h4 is important. Why h4? Why not g4? Why not g3 or h3? I'll show you. So, for example, if they play king e7, now they want to chase us away with g6 move. We play h5, and g6 is not playable. If we play g6, we can win a pawn. I don't think that we even need it. Maybe we can go to that side, and if they take, we invade their enemy camp, and it's still a winning position. Again, if they trade, we can play f5, h4, and b3. So for example, they play h6, we play this, we take, the king cannot go to that side, and these two pawns can stop these three. So this is an example of a pawn endgame that is winning without a pawn. So king c7, for example, king b5, you take there, and then you use this pawn to distract the king, while your king invades the enemy camp and captures the pawn's left. What happens if they don't take on h5? For example, what happens if they play this move? Who can tell me? So g4? No, g4. That was a previous comment. Okay, let's play h6. It's actually a Zugzwang. Yeah, I agree. Let's play this. So they play this, we play that, they play there. So king c3. And if rook goes somewhere, we can play rook c7. How does it work? The next move is this, after which we promote. So they have to play king d6. But then rook c8 anyway. That's why they cannot move the rook. That's why after king c3, they have to push the pawn, which allows us to invade and capture the b7 pawn, or move the king. But moving the king still allows us to invade the enemy camp. b3. Finally, they move, and we capture the pawn on b6 and promote another pawn then. So this is how h5 worked. Well, this didn't happen in the game, but if it did, then h5, h6. So h5, well, maybe if they play king f7, well, king f7, you can just wait, because moving the rook this time means you promote. And if they play g6, capture, or no, just go back, king f6, and then you play the same thing. Well, this time you can actually capture, the king captures, and then you can win the pawn on h7 or maybe f6. It should be winning too. Or in this position h6, and then you threaten to take with a check. Because if king f7, then you invade the enemy camp. If king d6, then you take with a check, provoking the king to go to d7, and then you can take there. You will be 2 pawns up, and h6 becomes a passed pawn too. Okay, let's go back. King f5, this is where they decided to take on d7. Having in mind that, well, this king is on f5, but after a rook's trade, he has to go back to e4. Well, it was h4, king f7, h5, king goes to f7, and if h6 is g6, so he decided to go to e4. And this is where black thought that this position is not losing. Why? Because this time this king has to leave a position and allow black to get the king to the center. The game continued with f5, king d6, but the king now has to retreat. And then black spent some time and resigned. So you may ask me why. Why in this position black resigned? It's actually fine. They can play king d5. Don't you think so? What do you think? After king d5, what white should do to win? Well, b3, white has extra pawn moves. White has more reserved tempi. That's right. And what did happen in the game? This king maneuver allowed white to grab space with f5 and h5, and because of that provided white with extra tempi, as well as made these pawns closer to the queen in line. What then? So king c3, king c4, king b5. This is the plan. How they can prevent it? They can try to move their king to e4 or e5 and capture the f5 pawn. Fine. King c4, king f5, king b5, and this pawn will be promoted faster, because in order to promote one of the pawns on the queen side, they have to first capture the pawn on g2. And you don't even need to calculate to realize that it takes more tempi than promoting your pawn on the a file. So king a5, king g2, a6, and this is where they only start the f pawn march. And this is a winning position. It's not even on f2. Even if it was on f2, it was okay, because we have more pawns on the board. Okay, fine. What if they don't? What if they don't move to e5, but for example, move back to d6, and for king c4 they prepare king c6? This is where you have to use your reserve tempi. King c7, king b5, king b7. Well, how to play? a5 should be fine, but let's play g3 just. They can play h6, but you play g4. If they make a king move, then you play this. They have to take, otherwise they lose a pawn, and then his king is still in a position. He goes there, you take the a5 pawn, and the enemy king will be distracted to the b pawn, while you invade the king side. Well, just for those of you who are not familiar with such endgames, so why do I always say that this is a winning position and how you should play there? Just one example will be illustrated to the very end. So here, let's say they don't allow us to invade the enemy camp. No, now they do. Okay, let's say he plays this move. If so, we can play king c6 and easily promote the pawn. So this king should be distracted to the b pawn, allowing us to invade the enemy camp and capture, if not all pawns, then all necessary pawns to let our pawns get promoted. So once again, let's summarize what happened in the game. Extra space allowed this king to go to e4. However, first white fights for the open file. And here only one file is open, it's the d file. We don't invade the enemy camp, which is usually a good move, because we'd better provide our king maneuver more priority, because the king in the center will defend the pawn on e5, there will be no f6. f6 was played, but with rook d6 we provoke a trade, and this time we took with a pawn. Having the rook on the 7th rank limits the enemy the king, and allows us to invade the enemy territory. So d7, and the pawn becomes poisoned. Every time black takes it, it's a losing position, because our king can get to d5, which means that it's already in the enemy territory, and enemy pawns are more vulnerable, as well as we have more reserved tempi to force the enemy king into Zugzwang and leave a position and let us invade the enemy camp. So then later we advanced our pawn further to f5 and h5, and that provided us with extra space and more reserve tempi to chase the enemy king away from our position. Fine, I think it was clear. Let's continue. We have so many complicated examples today. Let's take a look at this position. It's white to move. The position is approximately, well, it's materially equal, but who is winning and why? This is the biggest question. And the second biggest question is what move white should play here. This pawn is hanging. This pawn structure is not perfect, but this pawn is far advanced, and the rook is already on the 2nd rank. So both all three pawns are vulnerable. What our plan here should be. How to locate our king and rook in this situation. So it's okay if you not only write down comments in the chat, but unmute yourself and say it if you have a good microphone. Okay, so Brian suggests f5, f4, supporting the pawn on e5 and then trying to promote it. As well as then Ruparel also suggests f4. Okay, great. What about rook f1? So maybe first we should save these pawns. Yes, it's too passive. Exactly. How black should play? Well, for example, a5. Then what? King takes c3, a4, so g4, rook e2, then h4, saving this pawn a3, and then the pawn goes to a2. Maybe there was a, well, king here, then rook goes there, rook a1, a2, and, well, now f4. Yes, but the rook is always tied down to the pawn. And if the king comes to take, then some of these pawns are vulnerable. Maybe instead, in this position, they can come closer. But then the king comes closer, and every time f4 is played, the g2 is hanging, and the white king is further from the place of action. Yeah, so rook f1 is passive. It's great that you understand it. That's why it's better to sacrifice some material, but make these pawns passed pawns. So c2, for example, doesn't make much sense. First of all, the pawn is vulnerable and you can take it. Second, you don't really need it. g4, king c7. No, actually, maybe then this, and then you take this pawn. That's why rook g2. Rook takes c3. So h2 is lost, but e3 now is protected by the rook, and the king may invade the enemy camp. So if rook h2, for example, it can be rook a3. And if they try to save this pawn, you can play e6. So here, there is a pawn on e3, which stops the enemy rook attack. This is additional factor that allows you to play for a win. And if they play something like that, with hoping that you push and then they attack like that, from behind, f5. And after this move, king d4. So if they take, you push. And the pawn will be promoted. So c5, king e4, and there is nothing they can do to stop a pawn. That's why king d7. The king goes to the center to block the pawn movements. Rook a3. So the a pawn is lost, but the king goes to the center. Rook a7. g7 is not hanging. So h5. What would you suggest for white? Let's play e4, f5. Let's bring the king, or maybe take the c6 pawn with the king, or what? Okay, h4. Okay, why h4? Aha, good point. Yes, h4 To block the h-pawn from progressing, not only to block the h-pawn from progressing, but to exchange the h-pawn, which is vulnerable to the g-pawn. So now in order to take, the rook has to go there, and every time the rook takes, the g7 is, well, g7 is lost anyway, but at least we stop the h5 pawn, and at the moment the pawn is not hanging, so they are required to play one temper to capture it. Rook g4 was actually played. King goes to d4. Now g6. They don't want to lose the pawn, but they want to capture on h4. So that's why rook g7. So if they take, we take too. So here black has to set their pieces passively, defending their pawns on c6 and g6. But white needs to find a way of how to break this fortress. What would you suggest for white? This king cannot move. This is another important thing to understand. And if g6 is lost, there will be two extra pawns for white, which guarantees a win. G5, this is a move that you suggest for black? What for? Okay, great. So king f4 is suggested. Fine, king f4, that's right. So they keep their rook on the g file. And how exactly do you win? Well, if you play f5, you lose. Your rook is lost. It's a check. So that's why you should follow what Dan suggested. Rook takes g6 first. Yeah, rook takes g6. Oh, yes, and arrows also probably mean rook takes g6 check. Yes, and it's actually winning. And those of you who suggested rook g6 and then f5, well, guys, my congratulations. You play better than Akiba Rubinstein because he didn't find it during the game. f5, king f7. Well, when I analyzed this game, I saw, wait a sec. If we take on g6, isn't it just a winning pawn in game? Yes, it is. And it is because we have an extra pawn. So f takes g6, king takes g6, king f4. This pawn is vulnerable. We can capture it until, until the moment when our king leaves a square of this pawn, we are fine. And the square of this pawn at the moment is huge. So it's this. Once he goes there, it becomes smaller. But our king is still inside it. What are we going to do? We are going to advance this pawn, helping with the king, and then capture this, leaving this pawn alive. It's too far from the enemy king. So, for example, king f7, king f5. If he plays this move, we capture it. So this, king goes there. Oh, what is better to play here? Okay, let's play this. Because if he starts promoting, then we promote too. I was also thinking about taking the g pawn, but no, taking the g is definitely not good. No, his pawn is just faster because I need time to capture. So this, and here white definitely wins because the kings are located in a position. So just one check forces the king to go to the c file, after which the queens can be traded. This time it's not even a trade, you just win a queen. If the king was close to the queen, it was a trade, and then you're winning. But maybe just you should be a little more accurate. So not this, but e6. So now the king goes to d5, captures the pawn, while the black king is too far from the pawn on e3. He definitely takes the one on e6, but he is too far from the other pawn. But if c4, take, this, and this is winning. Now, well, again, how? Because we know that we cannot promote the pawn if the king is blocking it. If it's only one pawn. If there is another one, then we win. For example, here you leave the pawn where it is, but let them take, and then you just promote the h, shouldering the enemy king. So here, if you don't want to calculate, just play this move. But I think you can just promote immediately. So this is winning, and I think it was quite transparent, and even calculation wasn't required to realize it. But this move wasn't played. Instead, he played rook c7. Rook c2, king goes to d3, then what? Rook c1, e4, rook d1, and finally white realized that in order to win, he should either take or he should move his king to the enemy territory. So now he threatens to take. So that's why c5. But after that, rook g6, and then the position becomes fully winning. They take the pawn on e4, but these two pawns are connected, and in addition, the enemy king is vulnerable to checkmate. So f6 and king e6, and the rook from the back rank will deliver checkmate. What else you should remember? Usually, well, this idea doesn't work. I mean, the idea of delivering a checkmate doesn't work because there are checks from behind, which force the king to move away. And in case of this check on c8, the king gets extra square on f7, for example. But this time, these are two connected pass pawns, and the king can shelter behind the e pawn. So rook a6, what else? Because otherwise it's this. Moving the king there still is completely losing. For example, you can just take first and then go and capture this pawn and then win the game. So let's say rook a6, king goes to f5. Brian suggests king d7. Wait a sec. Let's say rook a8, king d7. It offers a trade of rooks, but I don't understand how you win. So let's say they play this move. So rook c8, or what? Oh, this move wins. This move wins with e8 idea. Again, not so sure. e7. This, king f7, and then what? Rook c8? No, not rook c8. So take h2, king d7. No, well, black is not losing here. Rook c8 immediately wins. Okay, so rook a8, king d7, rook h4, rook c8, rook takes c8, king takes c8. So h3, king d7, h2, e6, h1, e7, king f7. No, it's still the same situation. Still the same. So no, it's not king d7. So after this check, you just go king f5 and then e6 and rook c8. So this. In the game, it was played rook c8 right away. It wins too. How? The king goes there. f7 is almost checkmate, so they have to take. This is where black resigned, but if they continued like that, check, we shall chase the king away. Then take and still threaten mate, as well as to capture the pawns. Even if that wasn't a checkmate, we would take there and then there. Okay. So this is how white won the game. But that was they realized such a plan. So this position with the king on the 4 and the rook on the 7th rank, this was the very best setup, and they realized that such a setup works in this exact position. So when they played e4, they thought that okay, e4 is a good position because these are passed pawns, and the rook should be somewhere here. To either cut the king or to attack the enemy pawns. So when you play the end games like that, you should definitely think about how to set your pieces and what you should do to win the game, or how you should set your pieces to not lose the game. Okay, fine. So let's now continue with our last example, which is the most complicated one. This. Here, black is even pawn down, but at the same time, black is winning. Why? Due to activity of their pieces. The knight is hanging. So this example is devoting to recognizing weaknesses and key squares. So what do you think black should be playing in this position? So, well, maybe they need to save the knight. Well, they definitely need to save the knight. I just don't know which move you suggest, either moving the knight or protecting it with king e7. Here, pawn structure is terrible. So white has extra pawn, but this extra pawn doesn't count. Why doesn't it count? Because two pawns on the queen side are able to stop this three. So here, material majority doesn't play any role. Okay, king e7 is suggestion, knight f6 is suggestion. But before you play this or that move, can you please explain because of which factors you can win the game here? And how exactly are you going to win? So in other words, I want you to come up with a plan. Okay, Brian suggests to capture weak pawns on the queen side. Well, it's logical. What else? White bishop and knight are not active, and we can take advantage of that too. Actually, that's right, especially the bishop. Well, actually, they both, but the bishop, look, here it's restricted. So, in fact, the bishop has only, well, these three squares. Four of white pawns are on light squares. Yeah, three pawns, okay. Okay, so Brian mentioned that g3 and g2 are potential weaknesses. Actually, g2. And this is one factor that tells us that we can win. Attacking this key pawn allows us to win. Well, maybe we don't checkmate there, but once we capture, the king has to go under a discovered attack and we can win material. So attacking g2 can be one plan. Attacking c3 or a3 can be the second plan. Restricting the bishop and trying to trap it is also a possibility, and all that have to be taken into consideration. The knight will move. It will move to f3. But maybe we will take advantage of it somehow. So this is how, well, black identified their potential ideas that they can do. So they understand their plan. So attacking pawns, trying to restrict the bishop, and attacking g2. Now the rest is just to find the setup which wins the game. King e7. Why? Well, to gain a tempo. Yeah, g3 is not important as g2 is, because capturing g2, well, almost wins the game. They move the rook, rook d3, to not blunder the pawn on c3. So what do you think? Capture and then try to win these pawns with our knight, like knight b6, knight a4, or not to capture? And if not to capture, then how to play? So Erosh suggests rook a1 because it's a tempo move. Okay, makes sense. Yes, if you trade, which occasionally can be played, especially if it's a blitz game, you're low on time, and people who are low on time, they always tend to exchange pieces, not really taking into account any consequences of such a trade. So bishop takes, then what? Well, here actually, if you want to win, you should even trade bishops. And if they take, you have a pass pawn and you can try to capture these pawns. But they won't trade. They will probably retreat. Then if knight e5, maybe bishop e2. So maybe you'd better play something like that. Knight b6, knight a4. But this only allows you to win a pawn and equalize position materially. But where is a win? So your rook is definitely more active and can create more danger to the enemy king's position. So you can attack the bishop, you can trap the bishop, you can capture the pawn on a3 as well as attack the pawn on a2. That's why it's better to keep your rook alive instead of just trading it. So the bishop moves. Well, I don't know. Well, this is a good move or not? What do you think? Doesn't seem so, right? Because knight e5 can be played, then knight c4. There is also this idea, but I don't see how to exploit it because they can play rook d2. Okay, so here I think knight e5 looks good. Okay, bishop e4, Brian said, okay, knight e5, rook d2, and then what? Rook a1? Well, I think this works, because where the rook goes? f2. Maybe they trade first. But if they trade first, you already pawn up. It should be a winning position, I think. Okay, so anyway, bishop a2, rook c1. What rook c1 threatens with this? This, both are vulnerable. So they play knight f3. Now, rook c2 doesn't look so good. If you play so, they play this move. You can still win a pawn on c3, but it's just a pawn. Still seems like a losing position, but anyway, so instead of rook c2, would you play better? Bishop e4 or take on e3? What is better? What do you think? You play bishop e4 or rook e3, and well, you won a tempo, but now your bishop is pinned. So this move, then this move. Okay, so please, guys, don't forget that there is a workshop on Sunday. After bishop e4, rook c2. What's the purpose? Oh, maybe. Okay, rook f2. No, they have enough defenders, but maybe we should add the knight. Well, I thought maybe this move, but then I realized that they are actually protecting it. So 95 doesn't work. Even if it did work, so 95, rook g2, king h1, and if now we try to win the rook by playing this discovered attack, they just sacrifice, and it's two minor pieces for a rook, so not winning. Maybe it's okay, but not winning. So they play this move to save the bishop. We take there. Well, I don't know. This. king G. Oh, no. Then let's save pawns. So king G2, this A4. There are 2 pawns, but maybe white is not losing. No, looks quite suspicious. The black's advantage is so significant that it's not an attractive idea to trade pieces in that way and then play an unclear endgame. So instead of bishop e4, what else can we do? Take on f3. If they take with a pawn, rook c2 works perfectly well. But if they take with a rook, then knight e5 should be played first. So the rook goes to e3 to not lose a pawn. However, king f6. So bishop b3. What do you think? Well, looks like we centralized the king, the knight. Our rook is active enough, but white is a pawn up, and they set their pieces passively, and it seems that it's enough to defend. Or maybe not. Rook a1. Well, rook a1, they can try a4. Rook b1. Rook a1, rook b1. Okay, rook a1, they play for rook b1. So bishop c2, rook c1. No, rook c1, it's a... So maybe this move. But then they can defend with a rook. Yes, they can defend with a rook. So not so clear. You can take on c4, but it's a materially equal position. Where is the win? Okay, I can give you a hint. The win comes from the white piece's passivity. H5 is good, but I don't think that you should play H4. Just H5. So let me explain why. So for example, A5 was played in the game, and let's say they play A4. So why they play A4? Because if not, then you play A4 with a pawn, then distract and take there, and then also there. I will show it a little later. So now what? H5, like Brian said. But why H5 in this exact position? Who can answer? How does H5 win the game? Look at white pieces. Not they are all, well, they are passive, and not only that factor is important, but also that they are in the Zugzwang. They can't move exactly, Mark. So h4, knight g4 fork. The rook cannot move. It's attacked by the knight. If the rook goes there, they lose there, and more pawns are lost too. The king has no squares to move. g4, the pawn is lost. So it's over. The bishop can move, but not so far. So for example, bishop moves to a2. How should we play? Rook c2. Let's play rook c2. I wonder if there is anything better. So bishop goes back, we play this. Bishop goes to d1, but the pawn on c4 is already captured. And other pawns are weaknesses too. c3 and a4. Okay, Uh-huh. Rook, rook e8. The result is 93 when the enemy pieces are vulnerable to it. Okay, so let me see. Let's say I start with rook d2. Ah, no, 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 no. This. No. This. Yeah, okay. So rook b1. Okay, okay. Maybe you're right, and we shouldn't provide them with such activity. Let's play better. After bishop d1, let's play rook a2 just. We are likely to take this pawn and then try to promote it. So how do they play to defend? If, well, again, the bishop moves, rook a3. Bishop moves again, then we take there, and then our pawns are protected. Okay, maybe instead of a bishop move, they play something else. Well, like rook a1 maybe. Rook e1, knight c4, rook e8. Oh, knight c4, there is bishop b3. So rook e1. Rook a1, we can play this move. I'm threatening with knight d3. Knight d3, knight b2. So how does it work? Knight goes, oh, king g1. Knight goes that way. The rook has to move to f1, and you can continue with what move? With knight b2? Yeah, knight b2 is enough. Bishop goes to b3. And I don't think trading rooks is the best. Just rook a3 and let's win this pawn. And then let's take the one on c4. Or maybe on a4. Okay, fine. Should be winning. So a5 was played. There are not so many moves white can play, so that's why they play bishop a4. But bishop a4 allows us to capture there. And what do you think happens if this rook goes to f3? In the game, the rook went to e8, but if it goes to f3, how would you play? Knight d2. Okay, thanks, Arush. Yes, it's knight d2. How does it work? Knight f1 becomes a threat. Rook d3, for example, but you can play knight f1, forcing the king to go there. Then you can play some discovered attack like that. The king moves, you go further, then you take there, even with your knight to attack the bishop. So you are several pawns up. Rook e8, but rook takes c3, rook c8, and knight a3 is possible, but they played knight e3, capturing this pawn. Because these can be captured with a rook, and then the bishop is under attack, so c5 is not under attack because of that. So black has already won one pawn, but there is still an attack on the king. And with this attack, black doesn't want to checkmate. They just want to chase the king away and capture some pawns. And the c pawn will be promoted. So this move, c4. This. G2 is vulnerable. So even without a bishop, we can still attack this pawn. Bishop c6, but c3. Bishop f3. And this is a completely winning position. Just no rush. What do you think you should do? Rook c1, c2, rook d1. But then they take on c2. So if you play rook c1 in this position, they go that way. There is a check. And your knight is hanging. Okay, so c2. If they take your knight, you play this move, but it fails because they control the c1 square. No, looks like it doesn't work so well. King f5. Well, bringing the king to the place of action is likely to be a winning strategy, but this time you can play better. So look at the bishop, which doesn't have any squares. Just g5 with g4 idea. Or even g5 with a 4 idea. So g4, f4, and this is where white resigned. Why? Because of rook c1 coming. This time the knight is protected and it's okay. So for example, let's play rook c1. So this king goes to f2, c2, rook move and c1. So king goes there, rook d1, rook c2. No. Well, it's still winning. This. King takes, knight a3. It should be still winning. Bishop a2. You bring the king then. So this. Then you're winning. Okay, fine. Yes, it's winning, but maybe there is a better way. Well, you can just play this move. How does it work? You threaten with c1, and if king d2, then you play rook d1, and then c1. This time it's a check, and it's poisoned because you promote then immediately. Okay, fine. So that's why they resigned. And if here they decide to move the king to h2, they can be even checkmated. So for example, rook c5, rook c1, they go to h2 and there is a checkmate. So this, if he goes that way, it's a checkmate on h1. If he goes that way, it's a checkmate on f1 because the pawn controls e3 as well as defends the knight on g3. So that's it. This is how the game was won. It's one extra pawn, plus this is a weakness, this is a passed pawn, the knight is well placed. So g5 was really a good move. Does delivering checks make any sense? No, this only allows us to activate the king. So it won't work. We can even block with the knight if we need it, but we don't. Okay, so what I want you to remember from this example is that first of all, you should identify because of which ideas you are winning or you are drawing in this endgame. Well, here, by looking at this position, you can say that your pieces are located more actively than the enemy ones. So what does it mean? It means that you should coordinate them. It means you should attack the enemy weaknesses, especially if these pawns are like separated and you can capture them and you can threaten them. So the second feature is a pawn structure. It's terrible. G2 is a weakness. This is a crucial square by capturing which you create serious problems to the king. It's not checkmate, but it's something that white should take into account because once you capture on G2 and then make a discovered attack, he can lose material. And not only a pawn, but even a piece or a rook. Another thing is the bishop. It has only a few squares to move to. On this diagonal, it's restricted. This diagonal is useless. And this is blocked by his own pawn. So evaluating and taking into account these factors allows you to come up with a proper play. Okay, so what do you think? Was our lesson today a bit complicated? Remember these three essential principles of what you should be doing. Activating the king, centralizing your pieces, king and rook, you should find a certain setup which allows you to progress, if not to win the game. And you should recognize critical squares to occupy them with your pieces, and key pawns that you need to attack in the enemy position. How to find such positions in a database? I have no ideas. Search if this position exists in any opening. Well, if you have a database, you can set the position and then ask ChessBase, for example, to search if such an endgame happened. But, well, the opening may happen even if you play 15 moves. But the end game, so here, for example, how many? 28 moves. So I don't think it happened. I don't think that this position exists in any other game that may be in the database. So not this exact position, but something similar. Uh, Something similar to practice. No, I don't think it's possible. I just know how ChessBase works, and there is no such a function to search. Well, yes, there is a way to practice, but it's not what Dan is talking. But this is also a helpful thing. So my recommendation is to use their endgame drills too. Okay, what else? Mm-hmm. What else? So I provide you with a homework, and let me explain, because this time it's only 3 positions, and I want you guys to get more engaged with the homework. And that's why we can partially work on it at the lesson. Just 5 more minutes, and we will be done. So what's going on in this position? It's white to move. They played king f1. What do you think black should be doing? So they have a perfect bishop. This pawn is a weakness, right? So the rook can try to attack it if this rook leaves. But how exactly to win? What do you think? Which of black pieces isn't placed well? Bring the king to the queen side. Well, not exactly to the queen side, but to the center. The white king is cut off, but you can bring your king. So the move that was played was h5 to stop g4. White reacted knight e1. It's not a good move, after which g5 was played. Rook c2, how to play? Well, rook a1. White played king e2, and this is the position that I want you to work on at as a homework. So this is the position that is set, and this is where I ask you to come up with a plan for black. I just wanted you to know the context. So what black should do? It seems easy to come up with a next 3 or 4 or 5 even moves, but is this idea winning? And what once you reach what you want to reach? So let's continue with the next example. So here, what do you think, guys? Is this trade, well, I think they have to take with the queen. Which pawn do we have to take? And what do you think if this trade makes sense for black? Does it improve position? Does it make the position winning for black? Or in a rook game with equal number of pawns, it's possible to draw? Okay, so what am I asking you when I say the word plan? The word plan means a series of moves. How many? Like even three, 3, 4, 5, up to 10, up to 15. There is no limits, but this is a series of moves which improves your position or makes the enemy position worse. So this is what I want you to find. So in that previous example, when h5, g5 was played, I want you to activate your pieces and then explain which winning ideas you have. So a plan is a series of moves. Suggest at least the next like 5 moves, for example. For that homework, that will be enough. So queen e4, if we take with the f pawn, I think it is a draw because our king is cut off. That's why we have to take with the d pawn. This check, well, they have to take it. I think so. Yeah, they have to take it. The king is vulnerable, too vulnerable. So take with the f, it is a draw. Why? Well, our king cannot move. There is rook b2, and this we cannot take because then we cannot stop. White cannot stop the pawn. So, but in case of rook b2, we don't really need to do anything. Just king g1, king g2, because this king cannot progress. If they trade, this pawn in game seems symmetrical. And if only we stop the enemy king from invading to c3, I mean, if white stops black from invading to c3, it's a draw. That's why capturing with the f looks drawish. Capturing with the d looks risky by the first glance because it makes this a protected pass pawn. For example, if you trade rooks, you may even lose. But maybe here you can find a certain setup which allows you to win the game. So in this position, after rook e2, I ask you to think about the plan. Well, rook e2 is required because the pawn is can be easily attacked by rook a1. Okay, so that was the second position. The third position. So this is about recognizing critical squares, weak pawns, and so on. What's going on here? White has some advantage because these pieces are a little passive, but looks like they are going to trade, and you have to decide whether you accept this trade or not. And if not, then what do you play? And if yes, then do you let them take or you take yourself? Also, looks like this bishop isn't a super bishop, right? So all your pawns are on light squares. Of course, there are open diagonals, but this bishop is not a super powerful bishop. But at least it defends weaknesses. So can you identify weaknesses in the enemy camp? b6 and h7. Well, maybe. Okay, so this is where I want you to come up with a plan and explain what you are going to play, how you are going to improve your position, which pieces you want to keep on the board, which pieces you want to exchange, and what are your main targets. Yeah, I would agree with Ellie, and the d6 pawn is a weakness too. Black has 4 pawn islands, white has 3 pawn islands. So these 3 positions I ask you to work on. I'm going to send you a PDF. There will be also a link to a Lichess study where you can check answers and see how your thoughts correspond with moves that happened in the original game. Well, for today we are done. Next lesson we are going to start with pawn and games, some basic things that maybe many of you know, but I'm sure it still does make sense to practice.